The idea sounded simple enough to be harmless. Strip everything back. No studio tricks, no layered vocals, no fixing mistakes later. Just four musicians in a room, playing live, the way they used to before the pressure turned every note into a headline. The project was meant to be called Get Back, and the goal was clear: prove they were still a real band. But the moment rehearsals began, it became obvious this wasn't a reunion. It was a stress test. Paul arrived prepared. Not casually prepared, structured, song outlines, clear expectations, a sense of urgency that bordered on anxiety. He wanted momentum, progress, something tangible to hold the band together. John, on the other hand, arrived inconsistently. Some days engaged, other days distant. Jokes replaced direction. Sarcasm filled the gaps where leadership used to be. That contrast mattered, because a raw project doesn't forgive imbalance. When one person pushes forward and another pulls sideways, the tension doesn't stay hidden. It becomes the sound. The cameras made everything worse. This wasn't just a recording session. It was documentation. Every disagreement was preserved. Every awkward pause became permanent. There was no privacy to decompress, no space to cool off after conflict. Creative friction, once useful, turned performative. There's a moment early in the tapes where the band almost locks in. For a few seconds, it feels familiar, tight, instinctive, alive. Then someone stops playing. No explanation, no argument, just silence hanging in the air longer than it should. That silence repeats again and again across the sessions, growing heavier each time. Later, people would describe the atmosphere as off. Some claimed the project felt doomed from the start, like something invisible was working against them. But the grounded explanation is far less mystical. Exhaustion, years of nonstop output, personal lives pulling in different directions, and most importantly, a band trying to recreate chemistry instead of letting it exist naturally. By this point, they weren't four equals anymore. They were four individuals negotiating space. Paul filling gaps to prevent collapse. John resisting structure he no longer believed in. George quietly realizing his voice wasn't landing. Ringo trying to keep the peace by staying neutral. And here's the detail that changes everything. The project never slowed down to address that imbalance. No pause, no reset. They just kept rolling tape. That decision sealed the tone of everything that followed, because once you force collaboration instead of choosing it, the music stops being about creativity and starts becoming evidence. And the evidence was about to get much harder to ignore. By the second week, the studio no longer feels neutral. It feels charged. Mornings start too early before anyone's fully awake, and the cold seeps in before the music does. Conversations feel clipped. Jokes don't land. When someone stops playing, no one asks why anymore. The room itself becomes part of the problem. They're recording in a space that doesn't forgive hesitation. High ceilings amplify silence. Every mistake echoes longer than it should. Cameras sit in the corners, always watching, always reminding them that this isn't just for them, it's for history. That awareness changes behavior. People perform tension instead of resolving it. Paul keeps pushing for structure. Count-ins are sharper. Instructions get more specific. Not because he wants control, but because chaos is spreading and someone has to anchor the room. But every push forward creates resistance. John leans back, disengages, deflects with humor that cuts just enough to sting. What used to be playful now feels pointed. George is the one who absorbs it all. His ideas surface quietly, then vanish just as fast. Suggestions are talked over or reshaped beyond recognition. Over time, he speaks less, When someone stops offering ideas, it's not because they ran out. It's because they stopped believing they'd be heard. Some later claimed the sessions felt cursed, that something about the environment drained energy, warped moods, pulled the worst out of everyone. But there's a simpler explanation. Creative dismissal is corrosive. Combine that with sleep deprivation, constant surveillance, and unresolved power dynamics, and you get a room that feels hostile without ever raising its voice. The physical details tell the story better than any argument. Slumped shoulders, instruments resting untouched against amplifiers, music stands knocked over and left there, like no one has the energy to care. When disagreements happen, they don't explode. They evaporate, leaving behind something heavier. Then it breaks. George says he's leaving, not dramatically, no shouting, just a sentence dropped into the room like an object you can't unhear. He's done, at least for now, maybe for good, and no one stops him. That moment matters more than most people realize. Here's the scale of what had already been captured by then. Over 20 days of rehearsals, nearly 60 hours of raw footage, dozens of unfinished takes, arguments, and false starts. And instead of stopping everything, instead of reassessing the entire project, the tape keeps rolling. That decision changes the meaning of what's being recorded. This is no longer a band trying to rediscover itself. It's a band documenting how far apart it has drifted. George eventually comes back, but something stays missing. And from that point forward, the absence isn't physical, it's emotional. And next, that absence spreads to the person everyone thought was holding the band. Together, John never announces his exit. That's what makes it unsettling. He keeps showing up, keeps sitting in the room, keeps holding a guitar. But something essential is missing. The sharp focus he once brought to sessions drifts in and out. Long stretches pass where he barely contributes, watching conversations unfold like they don't involve him. When he does engage, it's unpredictable. A joke lands too hard. A comment cuts sideways. Humor becomes armor. It deflects responsibility while quietly reminding everyone that he's not invested in steering the ship anymore. Later, people tried to pin this shift on a single cause. Personal distractions, creative burnout, substance-era fog. The truth is less dramatic, but more uncomfortable. John had emotionally moved on from the version of the band this project was trying to resurrect. Get Back asked him to rewind, to pretend the last few years hadn't changed him, to strip away experimentation, distance, and evolution, and he wasn't interested in pretending. Some fans claim John intentionally destabilized the sessions, that he wanted chaos, that he knew the band was ending and decided to speed it up. There's no proof of that, but there's something more revealing than sabotage: disengagement. When someone stops caring about outcomes, they don't need to destroy anything. They just stop protecting it. They stop smoothing tension, stop mediating, stop investing emotional energy. And that absence creates space for everything else to fall apart. Paul feels that vacuum immediately. He talks more, directs more, pushes harder, not because he wants power, but because silence is spreading and silence feels dangerous. To some, this looks like control. To others, it looks like panic. Both interpretations can exist at once. There's a recorded exchange where Paul openly admits he feels like the bad guy. He talks about not knowing how to lead without being resented, about feeling responsible for keeping things moving while being blamed for doing exactly that. It's one of the most vulnerable moments captured during the sessions, and it changes nothing, because vulnerability doesn't fix imbalance, especially when the person with the most influence has already checked out emotionally. The numbers quietly underline the reality. 3 members actively pushing the project forward, 1 member drifting in and out of engagement. 0 shared vision for what the album should be. By now, the sessions stop feeling collaborative. They feel provisional. Every song is a negotiation. Every take feels temporary, like no one believes this version will be the final one. And that's when John makes a move that sounds practical, but lands like a fracture. He agrees to bring in an outside producer to finish the project. To him, it's relief, distance, a way to escape the room without walking out. To Paul, it feels like losing the last bit of control over something he's been desperately trying to hold together. That decision doesn't just change the sound of the album, it changes who owns the ending. And once that door opens, it can't be closed again. Bringing in an outside producer sounds harmless on paper, practical even. The sessions were dragging, morale was unstable, songs felt unfinished. From the outside, it looked like a solution. Inside the room, it felt like surrender. By the time the decision was made, the project had already drifted far from its original purpose. What was meant to be raw and immediate now needed rescuing. And when someone needs rescuing, someone else gets to decide how the story ends. The producer chosen wasn't known for restraint. He was known for scale, for overwhelming sound, for turning fragile ideas into towering monuments, exactly the opposite of what Get Back was supposed to be. Paul hears the first changes and feels blindsided. Songs he remembered as intimate now swell with strings. Choirs appear where silence once lived. The rough edges, flaws that proved the band was still human, are smoothed away. To him, this isn't finishing the album. It's rewriting it. John, at least, publicly, supports the move. He's relieved. The pressure is off. The room he wanted to escape no longer has final authority over the music. Later, his feelings shift. Whether that's regret or hindsight depends on who's telling the story. This is where the narrative fractures permanently. Some listeners say the finished tracks feel heavy, almost haunted, like the production is trying to bury something uncomfortable underneath layers of sound. Others hear beauty, closure, a sense of finality that fits a band at the end of its life. Both reactions are valid, because the album isn't just music anymore. It's a compromise frozen in time. Here's what the numbers quietly reveal. 4 major tracks substantially altered, multiple overdubs added without full band agreement, months of delays, while tensions escalated off tape. By the time the album is finalized, it barely resembles the original concept. Even the title shifts. Get Back, a command, becomes Let It Be, a surrender. And that change matters, because titles frame meaning. One looks backward, demanding restoration. The other accepts loss. When Paul publicly objects, it's not just about strings or choirs, it's about authorship, about who gets to decide what this album represents, about whether the band's last statement should sound like a struggle or a polished goodbye. No one wins that argument, because the album is released after the band is already gone. That timing locks everything in place. No corrections, no shared explanations, just a finished product dropped into the world like a note left on the table after everyone has walked out. And from that moment on, Let It Be stops being a project. It becomes a document. Not of what the band wanted to say, but of how they failed to say it together. When the album finally reaches the public, the band is already finished. Not fading, not on a break. Finished. Lawyers are involved, statements are careful, friendships are strained beyond repair, and into that silence the record drops. That timing rewires everything. Listeners don't hear these songs as a work in progress or even a final experiment. They hear them as a goodbye, whether the band intended that or not. Every lyric suddenly feels heavier. Every harmony sounds fragile. Moments that might have once felt loose or playful now land like confessions. The title doesn't help. Let It Be doesn't argue. It doesn't demand. It accepts. To some fans, it sounds peaceful. To others, it sounds defeated. Rumors start immediately. People claim the album feels wrong, that something about it is unsettling, that it carries the weight of unresolved tension like a message recorded after the decision was already made. A few even describe it as cursed, not because of what's said, but because of what's left unsaid. The grounded explanation is simpler and more uncomfortable. When you know the ending, you reinterpret everything that comes before it. Meaning shifts retroactively. Lines that once felt vague now seem deliberate. Silence becomes symbolism. Critics are divided. Some praise the emotional honesty. Others call it unfocused, messy, even uncomfortable to listen to. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. It doesn't feel like a celebration. It feels like documentation. Sales are strong. The name alone guarantees attention. But the reaction is fractured, mirroring the band itself. Fans argue over intent, over blame, over whether this was a necessary release or something that should have stayed private. Here's the scale of that moment, released weeks after the breakup became public, arrives alongside legal disputes still unresolved, becomes the last official statement by default, and that default matters, because the band never gets to frame the narrative together. There's no unified explanation, no shared interview, just four separate perspectives slowly drifting farther apart over time. Paul distances himself from the album almost immediately. John's comments fluctuate. George grows more vocal about creative frustration. Ringo stays measured, caught between loyalty and reality. Instead of closure, the album creates a permanent question mark. Was this the band's final truth, or a distorted snapshot taken at the worst possible moment? That question keeps the record alive in an uncomfortable way. It refuses to settle into nostalgia. It doesn't age quietly. Every reissue, every remaster, every anniversary drags the argument back into the light. And eventually someone tries to fix it, not by explaining it, but by undoing it. For years, the argument refuses to die. Fans debate, critics revise. The album sits in an uncomfortable place, too famous to ignore, too disputed to feel settled. And then, decades later, someone decides to intervene. The idea is framed as a correction. Strip away the excess. Remove the strings. Peel back the choirs. Present the songs the way they were meant to sound. Not reimagined, not rescued, just exposed. Let It Be. Naked arrives with confidence. No ambiguity about its intent. This is the album without the interference, without the gloss, without the ending that felt imposed rather than chosen. For some listeners, it's a revelation. The songs feel lighter, more fragile, more human. Details buried for decades suddenly breathe again. Mistakes feel intentional. Silences feel earned. For others, it feels like revisionism, because once you change the record, you change the memory. And memory is where this album has always lived. Here's the scale of its impact. Millions of streams within its first year, immediate chart re-entries across multiple countries, side-by-side comparisons flooding forums and reviews. Instead of settling the debate, it splits it cleanly in two. One version sounds like surrender. The other sounds like resistance. And now both exist at once. That duality creates a new kind of unease. Which one is real? The album that closed the band's story in real time, or the one reconstructed years later, after history had already passed judgment? Some listeners describe the experience as unsettling. like hearing two endings to the same story, like opening a letter twice and realizing the words have changed. There are claims that the stripped version feels truer, almost ghost-like, as if the songs were waiting to be freed. But the grounded explanation is simpler. Context alters perception. When you know what was added, what was removed feels purer, even if it isn't more honest. What makes this moment so important is intention. Naked doesn't pretend to be neutral. It takes a side. And by doing that, it confirms something uncomfortable. The album was never finished in a way everyone agreed on. It was paused, frozen, released mid-argument, and by reopening it, the argument becomes permanent. Because now the question isn't just what happened, it's who gets to decide what really happened. And just when the debate feels exhausted, something else appears. Something far more powerful than a remix. Footage. Hours of it. Footage that would change who the audience blamed and who they understood. When the footage finally surfaces, it doesn't arrive quietly. It arrives with weight. Hours upon hours of unedited moments that were never meant to be seen this closely. No narration telling you what to think. No selective cuts designed to protect reputations. Just time, rolling forward, exposing everything. And almost immediately, the old narrative starts to crack. For decades, the story had been simple. Paul was controlling, John was detached, George was sidelined. The album was the result of one voice overpowering the rest. The footage complicates all of that. Paul doesn't look like a tyrant. He looks anxious, restless, afraid of dead air, afraid that if he stops pushing, the whole thing collapses. You can see him trying to pull music out of silence, filling gaps because no one else will. Leadership and desperation blur until they're indistinguishable. John, meanwhile, isn't absent in the way people expected. He jokes, he engages, he even defers at times. But there's a distance that never fully closes. He's present, but not anchored, like someone already imagining life beyond the room. George's frustration finally makes sense. It's not about one argument or one song. It's about accumulation, about years of being the quiet voice in a loud partnership. When he speaks, it's measured. When he's ignored, it's visible. Some viewers describe the footage as eerie, like watching people move toward an ending they don't yet recognize. There's a strange calm to it. No screaming matches, no explosive fights, just the slow erosion of alignment. Others claim the tapes feel haunted, not by anything supernatural, but by inevitability, like watching gravity work in real time. The grounded explanation is simple. Long-form context removes mythology. When you see everything, moments stop being symbols and start being behaviors. Heroes and villains dissolve. What's left is friction, and friction doesn't care about legacy. The footage doesn't absolve anyone. It redistributes responsibility. Paul wasn't trying to dominate. John wasn't trying to sabotage. George wasn't overreacting. Ringo wasn't disengaged. They were four people operating under incompatible emotional timelines. What makes this revelation so destabilizing is that it arrives decades too late. There's no chance to respond together, no opportunity to reframe the ending as a group. The audience gets clarity, but the band never does. And that clarity creates a new discomfort. If no one was fully wrong, then no one was fully in control, which means the album wasn't shaped by intention, it was shaped by momentum. And once something reaches that point, it stops belonging to the people who created it. It becomes something else entirely, something that exists between versions, between explanations, between truths. And that's why, even now, the argument refuses to die, because the footage didn't close the case. It made the mystery harder to escape. At some point, Let It Be stops functioning like an album. People don't play it casually. They analyze it, freeze moments, argue over seconds of silence like they're clues. The songs aren't just heard, they're inspected. That shift matters, because art invites interpretation. Evidence demands judgment. Listeners start asking questions the band never meant to answer. Who's leading here? Who's pulling away? Why does this harmony sound strained instead of warm? Why does that lyric feel unfinished, almost reluctant? Suddenly, every imperfection becomes meaningful. The rough vocal on one track is no longer a stylistic choice. It's exhaustion. A late entrance isn't just a mistake, it's hesitation. Even silence starts to feel intentional, like someone choosing not to speak when it mattered most. Some claim the album captures something unnatural, that it feels heavier than other records, that listening to it is uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain. Not sad, not angry, just unresolved. But there's a grounded explanation for that unease. This album documents a process that never reached consensus. Most records represent agreement, even if that agreement was forced. This one doesn't. It freezes a disagreement mid-motion and asks the listener to finish the thought. That's why it feels incomplete without actually being unfinished. Here's the scale that quietly reinforces that feeling. Recorded across multiple locations as plans collapsed, assembled from dozens of takes with no unified vision, released while legal and personal separations were still unfolding. Those numbers matter because they show instability, not chaos, but drift. Direction changing faster than intention could keep up. Fans try to resolve the tension by choosing sides. Some hear Paul fighting to preserve something real. Others hear John letting go of something already lost. Some focus on George's restraint. Others on Ringo's patience. Everyone hears what they're already looking for. And that's the danger. Once an album becomes evidence, it stops being neutral. It turns into a mirror. People project their own beliefs about leadership, loyalty, and endings onto it. The record absorbs those interpretations and reflects them back stronger. That's why it never settles into nostalgia. You can't safely remember something that still feels unresolved. Every attempt to remaster it, contextualize it, or explain it only sharpens that edge. The more clarity you add, the more obvious the fracture becomes, and beneath all of it sits one uncomfortable truth. This album doesn't document the end of a band. It documents the moment they stopped agreeing on what the band was. And once that happens, no version, stripped down or fully produced, can restore alignment. All that's left is interpretation, which leads to the final question. Not about sound, not about blame, but about whether this album was ever meant to be understood at all. Most albums age quietly. They settle into memory, the sharp edges soften, arguments fade. This one never did. Every time Let It Be resurfaces, through a remaster, a documentary, a new wave of listeners, it reignites the same discomfort. Not because people disagree about how it sounds, but because they disagree about what it means. That's the clue most people miss. Albums that represent unity invite nostalgia. Albums that represent fracture invite investigation. This one does the latter, endlessly. There's no clean villain hiding in the grooves, no single betrayal that explains everything. Paul didn't hijack the band. John didn't burn it down. George didn't abandon it. Ringo didn't disappear. What happened was slower, quieter, and harder to confront. They stopped sharing the same future. Once that happens, every creative decision becomes a compromise instead of a collaboration. Every song becomes a negotiation, and every finished product carries the weight of what wasn't agreed on. That's why this album feels unstable. Not cursed, not haunted, just unresolved. Some people still insist it should have stayed buried, that releasing it exposed wounds that didn't need public air, that it turned a private breakdown into a permanent exhibit. Others argue the opposite, that burying it would have been dishonest, that this was the only truthful ending possible. Both positions make sense, because this album doesn't ask to be loved, it asks to be reckoned with. It forces listeners to confront an uncomfortable idea, that endings don't always arrive with clarity. Sometimes they arrive mid-sentence, mid-song, mid-argument, and once they do, there's no version you can release later that fully explains what went wrong. That's why no remix ever fixes it. That's why no documentary ever closes the case. That's why the debate survives every generation. This album didn't fail because it was messy. It unsettles because it's honest about how creative partnerships actually end, not with explosions, but with misalignment. So, when people say Let It Be was an album that shouldn't exist, they're half right. It shouldn't exist as a neat conclusion. It shouldn't exist as a clean goodbye. It shouldn't exist as a story with winners and losers. But as a document? As proof of what happens when momentum replaces agreement? It couldn't not exist. Which leaves only one question, one that still splits listeners down the middle. Was this album buried because it betrayed the myth, or because it told the truth too clearly to ignore? And once you choose your answer, you'll never hear it the same way again.